Hi, everyone. This is Derek Chollet from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome for this morning's discussion on Europe's response to the coronavirus crisis. This was going to be the first in a series of updates we're going to be doing with our European-based colleagues to talk about the crisis as it's unfolding throughout Europe as in the form of sort of an update, but then also to begin wrestling with the profound policy questions that this crisis is raising and the policy responses to it. So this morning, I'm grateful to be joined by three colleagues from three of our European offices, starting with Alexandra Scheffer from our Paris office, Alexandra is the Director of Research for Transatlantic Security and the Director of the Paris office at GMF. Next, we'll have Bruno Lété from our Brussels office. Bruno is a senior fellow focusing principally on transatlantic security issues based in our Brussels office. And finally, we'll be joined by Jan Techau from our Berlin office. Jan is the Director of GMF's Europe program and a senior fellow based in Berlin. So what we thought we'd do this morning is we'll ask our three discussants to give very brief opening comments about the situation as it's unfolding from where they're sitting comfortably in their homes, and also to talk a little bit about some of the policy debates as they're unfolding from the perspectives of Paris and Brussels and Berlin. And then we'll open it up to your questions, which you can send to us via the Q&A function on this platform, as well as the chat. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Alexandra first to start things off. Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you very much, Derek, and happy to kick off this conversation. So I'm based in Paris. Just to give you some key figures about France. As you know, France is one of the European countries that has been the most affected by the COVID crisis. Just in terms of the figures, around 300,000 cases have been identified, knowing that these numbers are, to my belief, very much underestimated because we don't have the same screening system as Germany has, and probably Jan, my colleague Jan in Berlin, will mention that. Around 1,070 people died in total, including yesterday a 16-year-old girl, which was a shock to the French population, and including as well 5 French doctors and a policeman. So the trends are still going up. We're basically following the Italian pattern with a week delay. I want to stop there because that information, you have it in the press and in the media. What I really wanted to emphasize was that for France, and I think for many countries affected by the COVID crisis, this is a crash test in many ways, a crash test for our societies, for our healthcare system. Today, the French healthcare system is totally overwhelmed. Like in many other countries, we have this controversy about the lack of masks, of protection outfits for the doctors, and the fact that we have an increasing number of doctors dying because they are not sufficiently protected is becoming a huge debate here in France. Which led our President Emmanuel Macron to make a speech just 2 days ago in front of the hospital in Mulhouse in the east of France, which is the region in France which is the most affected by the crisis, and where the military actually came and support the people there. He announced a massive investment plan in the healthcare system, probably too little, too late. That's at least how this is analyzed here in Paris. Why is this a crash test for the French society? Because, everybody knows probably over the phone or in front of their PCs about the yellow vest movement, This is again putting our social fractures in the forefront. You have those like all of us actually today who have the luxury of being able to work remotely. And there are many, many others that don't have that possibility and that need to continue to work, sometimes in very risky, complicated conditions. And these are, of course, the people that keep our economy running, right? Policemen, cashiers, medical staff, obviously, all of these people that are much more exposed than us to the virus. They are at the front line. That was the purpose of President Macron's speech just 2 days ago. And they are very much part of this, periphery, la France de la périphérie, the people that, have been requesting for higher salaries and for better working conditions. So I think that one very useful question we should all ask ourselves when analyzing this COVID crisis is to what extent this crisis has increased, reinforced trends that have already been existing before, and to what extent will they, be even worse, and how can we face that once the COVID crisis will be more or less managed. The second crash test, obviously, is for our economy. We have a first estimate of the economic impact that has just been released by our National Institute of Statistics, l'INSEE. Basically, just to summarize very quickly, 1/3 of the French economy has stopped. Services, tourism, construction, consumption. 1/3 of France is working remotely. 1/3 of France is still going to work in their workplace. And 1/3 of French people are in partial unemployment. And so the projections in terms of the economic impact shows that if we continue a 1-month lockdown, as we are right now, it's been 2 weeks we're in lockdown, but if this lockdown continues over a period of 1 month, the impact is approximately evaluated at a loss of 3 points of the French annual GDP, which leads me to the third crash test, which is a crash test for political leadership. It's not specific to France, it's everywhere around the world. This is a big test for our political leaders, obviously. The impression here in France, and you see that in the recent polls, is that the French people are losing confidence in the Macron government and the way it has been responding to the COVID crisis. The latest polling shows that more than half of the French people think that the government didn't take the crisis seriously in the initial phase. I personally think that the president and their government didn't take the crisis seriously in the very initial stages. He was basically comparing the crisis to another major flu crisis and that things would basically be all right. And there you have the crisis about the total lack of mask and any kind of protection, including for those who are at the front line, our doctors and nurses. 80% of the French don't know where the government is heading, and 70% of the French think the government is not telling the truth. And that's a problem, because there is really a problem of trust and confidence about the strategy that the French government has been following from the start. The strategy has been, and you might not know that, to rely on a scientific council. So it's a group of very highly recognized French doctors, infectiologists, epidemiologists, experts that know about these issues of virus. And they have been pushing for this almost total lockdown of France, of the entire population, instead maybe of exploring a third way, which is what Germany did immediately, which is massive testing. Germany today is testing 500 people a week. And France, because of apparently technical issues, is not able to conduct this massive testing. And so instead of testing and confining those who are, have the virus, the whole population is actually confined and locked down. And so to me, when you are, taking the measure to lock down an entire population, it means that it results from, to a certain extent, a failed policy and a failed strategy. And this is the way the population here in France is analyzing President Macron's strategy, which leads me to the sort of inflection point we have been looking at these last few days, which is as we are now ending the official 2 weeks of lockdown, people are starting to doubt about the strategy. We see that now Macron is trying to change and to rethink the strategy and looking at Germany as a model or sort of example in terms of massive testing. But again, there are some technical issues. I'm not an expert, but that leads to the fact that we are not able to do that, at least very quickly. And then there is the digital strategy that countries like Singapore or South Korea have been using, which is about identifying persons that have been in contact with people that have been infected with the virus, and therefore do a smarter preventive job. So what's interesting from my perspective is that we are looking more at non-Western models of crisis management, Singapore, South Korea, and taking these examples a bit more seriously as we are getting much more nervous about the potentially catastrophic economic consequences of a total lockdown. So this is where the French debate is now. As you know, we're having a very big debate also about the vaccine, about the chlorine, about all of these issues. President Macron has been the most prominent voice to warn that a vaccine is not imminent and probably won't arrive until the end of 2021. And therefore, the message is clear once again, the population will not be able to stay at home during that whole time. And so the question is, well, what is the exit strategy? And what you're already seeing is a double message coming from the government. Of course, you need to stay at home, but those who can still continue to work, please do. And by the way, we're asking companies, big French companies, to help financially the people to continue to go and work with a 1,000 euro one payoff payment, for example, to encourage people to get back to work. So again, you see this very difficult balancing act, which I think is not just a French phenomenon, but between the idea of social distancing and the risk of economic collapse. And this is where you have this third way now. Let's put the emphasis on testing, testing, testing. But once again, how do you operationalize that is an issue here in France. To conclude, and to bridge with what my colleague Bruno will say about Europe, what's the exit strategy? I think nobody knows, our leaders don't know. The exit strategy obviously is national, but is also European. What I see happening is the North-South divisions inside the EU still very present, increasing. Once again, it's interesting to see how this crisis is not creating, but revitalizing and fueling once again lingering resentment over the handling, for example, of the Eurozone crisis a decade ago with this North-South divide, and which have been enhanced by the recent fury over the initial unwillingness of other EU countries to come to Italy's aid with medical equipment. So that seems to me really interesting to see how these trends have once again put at the forefront through this COVID crisis. France, as you know, sees itself more as a southern country next to Italy, Portugal, Greece. There's also Belgium in the group of European countries asking for more solidarity, for Corona bonds, this sort of idea that we should put together a common debt instrument to help finance the response to the COVID crisis, which for northern countries like Germany, like Finland, like the Netherlands, Austria, is just not an option. And so this is part also of the European debate. Very lastly, because we are a transatlantic organization, and obviously the transatlantic dimension is present in everything we do. Obviously, this crisis needs to have a transatlantic response. As you know, our president Macron and Trump are working together to try and put together a more multilateral response. I believe that now that America is first, if I can use that term, in terms of the country that has the most coronavirus cases, hopefully this will be an incentive for the Trump administration to realize that this crisis needs to have a collective multilateral global response. And so there's the national, European, transatlantic, but also global layer. And so the post-crisis management will have to deal with these different layers in a much more coherent way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexandra, for that update. And it's striking how many parallels there are to what's the debate in Paris about everything from the state of testing to how there can be a more nuanced approach to some of the social distancing. We're having the same debates here in the US. Bruno, over to you from Brussels.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you. I was listening to Alexandra with great interest because even though Brussels is only 300 kilometers away from Paris, there are really some differences here in Belgium compared to France. First of all, from a medical perspective, unfortunately, the infections are still on the rise and the number of diseased people are also still on the rise, but the trends are a bit more moderate here, I would say. We now have about 6,000 infections and around 280 people are now dead, very much unfortunately so, but the rising trend is more moderate. We see maybe every day 15 to 20% in terms of increases here in Belgium. So it is of course very severe, but it's not as serious as what we see, for instance, in Spain or Italy. I think one of the reasons for that is that because Belgium was one of the first countries that actually went into lockdown, just like France. We are already in lockdown here for 2 weeks. But there's also a number of other reasons, I think. First of all, Belgium prepared quite well in terms of healthcare and preparing our hospitals and our emergency services. We were very carefully looking at how the situation unfolded in Italy. And so, for instance, today in Belgium, there are about 600 people now in emergency room, but the government was very quick in boosting the capacity to now almost 3,000 beds. So 5 times as more as is currently needed. And this capacity can still be going up. Today, well, the current restrictions normally are in place until 4th of April. But today, Belgium's National Security Council will be coming together. There's actually should be a decision any minute now. It's widely expected that the lockdown will be extended till the 3rd of May, that the current measures will stay in place until then. But the mood of the people here is, I would say, almost pretty normal. There's no panic. We don't really see that, and the restrictions are being more or less well respected. In terms of politics, and this is actually quite an interesting thing to observe. So before the corona crisis erupted here in Belgium, the kingdom was actually in deep political impasse. It was already for 1 year that the political parties were negotiating to form a government. There had been elections in Belgium about a year ago, and there was a complete impasse. But the political parties were very quick in realizing the gravity of the situation, I think, and all the parties came together to actually support the caretaker government, to give this caretaker government the powers of a normal government. And so actually, this is a very good thing for the country. Belgium now has a real government that can deal with the crisis response. Belgium is also a federal state, like the United States, and we really see that both the federal level and the regional level are closely coordinating and working together in a good spirit. So This is unusual for Belgium, I would say, because we are a small but very complex political entity. But the coronavirus has really brought politics together in the country, which is actually quite nice to see. And I think that our populations are also observing that the government is taking this seriously. And we really see a confidence among the people here in Belgium that the government is apt to deal with the situation. I think what is now still mostly a medical crisis is slowly evolving into an economic crisis. Belgium is the 24th economy in the world. It has about a GDP of 500 billion euro. That's about a third of the size of Texas, roughly the size of Michigan, the economy of Michigan. But already we see the first hits that are coming. 1 million people are on technical unemployment in Belgium. That's about 10% of the population. There were just predictions released yesterday about what this lockdown will do to the economy. So we are already 2 weeks in lockdown, and the experts say that if we go until 4 weeks, the economy will shrink around 2%. And if we stay in lockdown for 6 weeks, the economy would shrink around 4%. So this will really hit the country quite hard. The government has also issued very swiftly a massive aid package for the population. For instance, if someone goes into technical unemployment, that person can retain 75% of its salary, and the government puts another 150 euro on top per month of this 75%. And there's also measures taken for businesses and SMEs. For instance, independent entrepreneurs have now the right to ask a support grant, about 4,000 euro that the government would give. They do not need to pay for gas, electricity, water, measures like that, that try to support the population. But it is very obvious that this crisis will put Belgium in a recession this year, and probably not just Belgium, but also many more countries in the European Union. Talking about the EU, Belgium is also the seat of the EU and of NATO, of course. NATO actually is playing a role in this corona crisis as well. We see that the alliance is using its strategic airlifting capacity to help move around medical supplies between member states. It has not been too much on the radar screen, but the alliance is actually playing a role in the relief nowadays. And from the EU, well, the EU is also doing what it can, of course. The EU, first of all, can only do what the member states allow the EU to do. So that's, of course, important to understand as a beginning. But already 3 weeks ago, the Commission activated the so-called Argus crisis coordination mechanism. This is a mechanism that now that gives powers to the European Commission to sync member state efforts in terms of medical relief, in terms of vaccine research, but also in terms of support for the economy and the industry. It's true that the European Commission was criticized at the beginning to be very slow in its reaction. There were a lot of reports of, for instance, member states refusing to export medical equipment to other member states, that there was no solidarity, for instance, with Italy. Now, the net result of that slowness, what we saw is that actually countries like China or Russia were quick to jump in and fill that void. We've seen quite big PR campaigns, if I can put it this way, from Russia or China, with airplanes flying into European nation states with medical supplies. But I think that the EU is now catching up. We see that the European Commission is boosting its efforts. We see that member states' solidarity is slowly but surely also increasing. For instance, the European Central Bank has also announced an aid package of around 1 trillion euro to help businesses and industry. So it is coming together. I think it's too much saying that the corona crisis would help the integration of Europe or even the integration of health systems. I think that's too much to say. But Europe is trying to do something. However, the bigger challenges for me, for the European Union, we see, for instance, that many principles, many values that hold Europe together are now, have been scaled back. National borders are back in the European Union, for good reasons, of course, but borders are back. We see that the nation state is now the principal and first responder, and populations are really looking at the nation state for relief. And I think that once the corona crisis will be over, the EU will really have to do a good job, but also will have a hard job in terms of PR to perhaps reinstitute some obvious things from before the corona crisis. Will it really be so simple, for instance, to once again have free borders within the Schengen zone? We see, for instance, that there are some countries, for instance, a country like Hungary, for instance, has now announced that the emergency restrictions, there's no end date to them. That is what the Hungarian government has now just announced, just as an example. So these are real things that we must think about, all member states together. I think it is really important that whatever we had before the corona crisis as European unity will also come back after the crisis.
Thank you, Bruno, for that update. And I'd like to turn over to Jan Techau now in Berlin and remind those listening or watching, we'll turn to questions after Jan, and submit your question via the Q&A function on this platform. Thanks. Jan, over to you.
Thank you, Derek, and thanks to everybody for joining. Good afternoon from Berlin. Very quickly on the virus side of the story here from Berlin, Germany is now at around 47,000 cases. That makes it the fifth largest country in that sense in terms of confirmed infections. It has had a comparatively low death rate on these high numbers of infections of 281 so far. These are numbers from Johns Hopkins University. And so the interesting thing about these numbers is that the doubling time, the time within which cases double here in Germany, has gone up from 2 days about 10 days ago, or 2 weeks ago rather, to 5 days today. Angela Merkel yesterday in a press conference said that we can perhaps start thinking about renormalization, or the first steps towards renormalization once we have gone up to 10 days. So slowing it down still is the order of the day. It was important, I think, that Merkel gave these numbers because it is a first kind of initial sign of the government preparing some sort of exit strategy, I think, at least trying to open a view, a perspective on how all of this could potentially end. Let me remind you that the country is not in lockdown, so there are no curfews. People are not forbidden to leave the house. They are forbidden to congregate in groups larger than 2 people, which basically amounts to a de facto curfew. But you can still go out, you can drive around, you can do your shopping. All of these measures, these super draconic measures, have not yet been taken. And so, it's not super strict, but at the same time, everything has pretty much come to a standstill anyways. We have all shops closed, all schools closed, obviously. Most people are at home. Lots of people have already lost their jobs. Unemployment rate has gone up. The German health minister, Mr. Spahn, has said yesterday that this is the calm before the storm. So he is preparing people for more dire times in terms of the numbers, and especially in terms of the cases that will end up in hospital and will then potentially clog up the health system. We have not yet reached the stage where the health system is clogged up. We have shortages here and there, and we have stressed out hospital personnel. There are stories from across the country where, of course, the increase is already there and can be felt, but we haven't seen a collapse yet. We haven't seen some of these dire reports yet that we saw from Italy, where doctors had to make very, very hard choices on whom to treat and whom not to treat. But the health minister expects that the numbers will go up and that eventually we will end up having an emergency situation in most hospitals as well. On the upside, Alexandra mentioned an interesting number, quite a remarkable number, I believe. Germany at the moment does about 500,000 tests per week, corona tests per week, which is an incredibly high number, which went up extremely quickly. I don't understand fully the economics behind this, how this was possible so quickly, but that's where we stand. And this, of course, is now widely seen as one key element in battling the crisis, that you actually know who's infected and who isn't. Germany also, despite losing about 20% of its hospital capacity over the last 10 to 15 years due to cuts and so on, still has about 5 to 10 times more ICU, intensive care units, in hospitals than comparable other countries in Europe. So that's also one reason why perhaps the death rate in Germany is comparatively lower, even though the science behind death rates is quite complicated, so I don't want to jump to conclusions here. So that's the virus side. There is the political side. Here we have seen action today in the upper house of the German parliament, you know, the federal chamber, if you will, the Bundesrat. They waved through the aid package that the Bundestag already agreed on Wednesday. This is an enormous package, the largest package of this kind ever in German history. We're talking about billions and billions of euros, either being ready to spend or being earmarked for aid in various categories. There are loan guarantees for companies that amount to about 400 billion. There is a fund now created so that companies in emergency cases can be nationalized. So the state jumping in terms of company ownership, that amounts to around 100 billion euros. We have credit lines readied by the German government-owned reconstruction bank, the KfW, about 100 billion. Aid for SMEs and individuals, 50 billion, wage support, 10 billion, all kinds of, you know, dizzying numbers floating around. The German government has announced that it will do an additional budget, an extra budget, and going into additional debt by about 165 billion euros alone within this budget year. So that's a pretty significant number as well. So we have, you know, the government acting quite swiftly. What we see here is a very positive rallying around the flag type effect. Some of the usual bickering that goes on a daily basis in politics has been actually fairly subdued in the last few weeks. The opposition is largely in line with the measures that the government has taken. And also the contest that was simmering within the Conservative Party over who's going to succeed Angela Merkel has completely been muted, not suspended. It's going on somewhere in the background, but basically the discussion about this, which was quite electrifying for the German political scene, has essentially ended, at least for the moment. We also see very much that this is the executive that, you know, carries the day. The poll numbers for Angela Merkel as a leader personally, but also for her party, are up. The CDU has recovered quite strongly, is now polling at 36%. They were down in the mid to low 20s, and that has you know, changed. The Green Party has lost support, and the right-wing, you know, populist AfD party has also lost. So clearly the moment of the government, clearly the moment of the executive. We have had a fairly steady performance by the Chancellor. She came late to the game, as she always, or almost always does, but once she comes to the game, she's quite firm and determined. She gave a quite brilliant speech about 10 days ago, which was seen largely as a turning point in the debate. Our health minister, and especially also the Prime Minister of Bavaria, also a conservative, all of them have performed quite well, and this I think has contributed to the boost of the Conservative Party's polling numbers. And then finally to the societal side, if that's a category, we do have, as I said in the very beginning, already a discussion about normalization, which freaks me out actually a little bit, because I think it comes way premature. But you can see that, you know, after 2 weeks of really severe inconvenience for people, it's really only been 2 weeks since people really had to restrict their lives in a way. We already have a debate about how too many civil liberties are being curbed, how some of that will never, you know, be given back by the state, how individual kind of, you know, lives are too much disturbed by all of this. I wouldn't say that this is a mass phenomenon yet, but it is audible. You can hear it. It's there. The debate is going on. And this is a fairly emotional divider already in some circles, certainly in some of my circles here. It's coming from both from the left and from the right. The right makes the argument that all of this is overdone and damages the economy too much. The left argues that all of this is overdone because it damages civil liberties too much. And so you have that divide building up. That could actually lead to interesting debates in the coming weeks. So far, this discipline is very high. These kinds of voices are still a minority program for the most part, but it is there and it could grow. Overall, I would say that people are taking it fairly creatively and with a certain kind of grit and good sense. I don't have too much of a panic idea, and perhaps compared to what Alexandra said about people losing confidence in government, here confidence in government is actually higher than it was before, again, the executive moment. And what I find remarkable, just to stray for 1 second from Germany, is that our Italian colleagues here in the Berlin office tell us that the same happens in Italy. Quite counterintuitively, the reputation of the government, of health institutions, of the police, of the military, all are up in Italy. So you can clearly see how there's some sort of rediscovery of the state, if you will, and that might be a longer trend as well. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jan. This is terrific. And we've got a bunch of questions coming in, and I'll ask the first one, which was on my mind, but it also has been echoed by several of the questioners who've offered it so far. And those who want to join in the conversation with a question, just use the Q&A function or the chat function on the platform. Alexandra, both you and Bruno mentioned the international dimension of this response. And Alexandra, I think you put it very well, that America is now truly first in this crisis in terms of the number of cases. And unfortunately, the outlook here is pretty grim, you know, in the weeks ahead in terms of how this crisis is going to unfold. But I guess to hear from each of you briefly about the perspectives. Alexandra, you mentioned that President Trump and President Macron are trying to cooperate. You know, how you see the U.S. response to this playing out, and then also as Bruno mentioned, you're watching Russia and China in particular try to fill a vacuum or take an opportunity here. Bruno mentioned how that's being seen. I'd be curious in Alexandra and Jan's view, and particularly Jan with you. Is there a debate? How is this impacting the debate in Germany about China and whether Germany should rethink its relationship with China? So why don't start with Alexandra, Bruno, Jan, very quick responses, and then we'll get back to another question. Thank you.
Yeah, very, very briefly on the perception of U.S. policy from France. Well, I think Macron is one of the most straightforward European leader when it comes to talking to President Trump, and he reacted pretty straightforwardly after the decision of Trump, without consulting once again European allies to close the U.S. borders to Europeans. I think it's more about the methodology once again, and the lack of consultation with who we think we are, which is the United States' most closest allies. And in a crisis like that, obviously we would need to discuss and cooperate much more. Now, I think there's going to be a shift, and we've already seen that in other foreign policy issues, where the United States suddenly realizes that it cannot act alone, especially with issues that do not have passports like this crisis, and so you need to work with others. So I hope that we are at a pivot time in the US, where the Trump administration will realize that this needs to be dealt globally, which leads me to conclude on that question that US leadership is absolutely indispensable and essential, because when you at the United States leads, this creates a sort of a coalition building trajectory that people want to follow. And so once the United States truly leads and wants to lead with others, this will encourage us Europeans as the first partners to also act in a more collegial way. The first reaction, and I think all of our presentations showed, was a very protective reaction. It was to think of France first, Germany first, the US first. It was about protecting, especially, I think, France didn't really anticipate this crisis, and the mask issue was truly a symbol of that, and a symbol as well, which leads me to answer the second question, of our dependency vis-a-vis China, because we were used to receive these masks from China, and suddenly China had to use it for itself. So of course, this is going to redefine many things in geopolitics, supply chains, all of that. This is very much into the French debate right now. It's very much illustrated in many of our Minister of the Economy, Bruno Le Maire, many speeches, which is how to rethink the way we depend on these countries, and how can we, maybe depend on our closest partners, which is our European partners and the United States.
Bruno.
Well, I'm a bit concerned about how the United States will be perceived among publics here in Europe. First of all, there's a massive amount of misinformation, disinformation going around in Europe about this topic. And as Alexandra said, there was really very little understanding at the level of the European Union, but also the national level, for the travel ban towards Europeans. It was unilateral. It was not coordinated prior with Europeans, and the way it was sold, this travel ban, for instance, in Belgium, was like, well, we can't go there anymore, but they made an exception for the Brits, the Irish, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, and the Ukrainians. So people just didn't understand how that would make sense. So I am really a bit concerned about how the publics are looking at that, for sure.
Okay, from Berlin, on the US and then on China. On the US, I mean, it's very closely watched and reported here what goes on in the United States, the measures taken by the US government and the announcements made by Donald Trump. It is less of a debate now than it would have been probably under normal circumstances. People are just too busy discussing their own stuff, but it is present. What I can say is, and this mirrors perhaps what Bruno just said, this is, of course, fairly damaging to the kind of wider public image of the United States, not just some of the measures taken by the president, but the entire kind of attitude vis-a-vis this, the old. It's clear to everybody over here that the U.S. has always been very strong on protecting its self-interest. That was never, seen as weird. But the old generosity that coexisted with strong emphasis on American national interest, that generosity that we've seen and that we were on the receiving end of here in Europe, that seems to be gone, and that's noted. And I think that costs the United States quite a bit of soft power, and perhaps also then later on hard political influence. On China, very quickly, because you asked about how China is being seen over here. The debate is there about China. It's almost purely an economic debate. It started with a shortage of goods that German companies produced in China that couldn't be delivered to Germany. The classic, health supply stuff, protective suits and face masks. And from there, it widened into a bigger debate about how much we are dependent on China as an economic player. Quite similar, I think, to the debate in the US. Only that we are not going to the extreme. I think over here that the US debate is characterized by, we're not talking about hard uncoupling, about a complete divorce of the two economic spheres, putting a brake on globalization and the relationship between us and them and these kinds of things. It doesn't go as far as this, but I think it is not too early to say that some of the supply chain issues, some of the questions as to whether certain products need to be produced back home and shouldn't be outsourced to players, even though it's German companies who produce them, but they produce them elsewhere. These kinds of debates are going on and will probably continue. And once the emergency and disaster relief plans are being made after this crisis, I'm pretty sure that some of this will have an impact on what we produce and how much we import from China.
Thanks, Jan. We're out of time, but I'd like to ask one last question, which kind of bundles together several of the questions we've gotten for a last quick lightning round with our panelists. The first is whether, given this crisis, the EU has any, as you said, any capacity to deal with anything else, or is everything maxed out? So whether that's Macedonia, the talks, Albania and Northern Macedonia, the fall of the government in Kosovo, or is this crowding everything else out? So can the EU walk and chew gum? And then secondly, particularly to Jan, but I think this I'd like to hear everyone's comments on this, is whether the North-South divide that Alexandra mentioned, whether that is being exacerbated, and that's in fact an opportunity that's being missed by Germany, that that the narrative that countries like Italy and Spain are being abandoned and kind of thrown overboard can take hold here, and that Merkel, in her caution and kind of reluctance to sort of assert leadership on a European scale here, is that just reflective of her nature? Is that this idea that the southern countries that are really bearing the brunt of this right now are kind of in some ways responsible for the crisis on themselves because of their general dysfunction? Anyway, just how you see that playing out, Jan in particular, but interested with Bruno and Alexandra as well. So can the EU walk and chew gum, and is this an opportunity being missed to further strengthen European solidarity? And this will be the last comment from each. Thanks.
Okay, I can perhaps come in, and then Alexandra can have famous last words in the end. Very briefly on, can the EU do other things than Corona? Yes, it can. I mean, this is one of the dirty little secrets of EU integration, that there's headline stuff and then there's all of the rest. This crisis makes the EU look bad because there's so little actual competence for the EU in these kinds of things in the treaties. So it doesn't have instruments or budget lines. But all the usual stuff, the compromise machinery that the EU constitutes, basically mediating a conflict between the member states on a daily basis, keeps on going. One, I think, big example of what can happen, even though there is a crisis going on, is that we have seen some diplomacy on the Balkans enlargement question, where Germany and France particularly have found a new formula and even a slightly revised procedure in which way countries from the Western Balkans can at some point down the line join the EU. This was frozen and put on ice by President Macron, and there seems to be now wiggle room there. This happened despite the fact that the crisis was going on. On Germany's position vis-a-vis Europe, does it miss an opportunity here? Should it be more generous? I think the response that we see from the German government on the Corona bond issue is guided by exactly the same kind of arguments that we've seen them actually reject the idea of Euro bonds earlier during the financial crisis. Debt mutualization, which is what this means, is something that is, anathema to the German political class pretty much across the board. You have the occasional outlier, specifically in the Green Party, also occasionally in the Social Democratic side, but by and large, this is not something that anybody really wants to touch. Merkel's response has been that the ESM, the stability mechanism, which is a reserve mechanism in times of crisis, that this should be a sufficient instrument in this case, is from that playbook. This is how she responded to this. I think it is important to note that, yes, we experts, and I have argued also that Germany needs to be way more generous, and that you can't have a common currency without also doing the political fiscal side together. But that is not the majority issue here at all. Pretty much, across the board, these kinds of things are toxic, and I wouldn't expect anybody to move on this at this point. It's interesting how entrenched these positions already are. I think it's a missed opportunity, but I can't change it, and I think it won't change.
Thank you, Jan. Bruno.
Well, again, I want to repeat that the European Union can really do only what member states allow the European Union to do. There's no magic trick here. But it's true that when the von der Leyen Commission came in, she promised like a geopolitical European Union. So far, we have not seen much about that. The team has only been formed late December. Then the Commission at large focused on the Green Deal, which is this €1 trillion package to fight climate change. Now the corona crisis is coming in, and we can be pretty sure that once the medical crisis is over, the European Commission will be focusing at least for another year on how to save the economy. So I'm not so sure, where the geopolitical strategy will come into that picture. I don't want to end on a gloomy note. It is not the end of the European Union. It is not the end of the euro currency. I think that all countries understand that solidarity will be needed to wither the recession that we are facing right now. But obviously, we'll have to see how these things progress.
Thank you, Bruno. And Alexandra, for the last word.
A few words. As Jan rightly said, the EU doesn't have a competency in health issues, but it does have a competency in crisis management and in civilian protection. And in fact, President Macron was actually the first European leader to ask assistance from the EU just the end of January, so at the very beginning of the corona crisis in France and in Europe, to operationalize this mechanism of civilian protection, and which, thanks to which actually France and Germany could repatriate some of their citizens from Wuhan in China at the very beginning of the crisis. So that's a concrete example of what can be done. I think the EU on this health issue can serve as what I would qualify as an organizer of intra-European solidarity. You've already seen that very concretely these last few weeks. Germany, after banning the export of masks, which was very badly received from other countries, has welcomed, in fact, many patients from other European countries suffering from the COVID-19 into its hospitals, including from France and mostly from the eastern part of France. So you see that solidarity really starting to work after an initial phase where the reaction was to focus on its national emergency. But I think what the EU should be also serving as is a organization to anticipate these type of scenarios, right? This is, the French initiative, the European Intervention Initiative that was launched by Macron in his Sorbonne speech in 2017, and which now gathers 13 European countries, including Germany, but also Scandinavian countries and many others, is purposely meant for that, to anticipate crisis scenarios where solidarity will be necessary to respond to this or that type of a crisis. And so I think this is where the EU dimension is actually critical.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, Jan, for those terrific presentations and updates. Thanks to all who have tuned in either via video or audio to this conversation. We will be doing this regularly, featuring colleagues from Europe to an audience primarily here in Washington about what's going on in Europe as this crisis unfolds. Also, GMF is responding to this crisis in a variety of ways, and on our website, either right now or later today, will be a series of short written pieces from colleagues from around the GMF network about how this crisis is impacting Europe and the transatlantic relationship generally. So stay on the lookout for that. So thanks, everyone. Stay healthy, stay safe, and have a terrific weekend. Thanks again.
Thank you.